if you could introduce yourself, your name and your affiliation.
Yes, my name is Peter Fisker. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Copenhagen, the Development Economics Research Group, and I've been working mostly in recent years on different measures of poverty mapping, and also on the effects of climate change and climate change adaptation, specifically in Ethiopia, but also across sub-Saharan Africa in different places.
If you were attending the upcoming COP in Baku, and you had an audience of politicians for, say, 3 minutes, what messages or findings from your recent paper on this topic would you want to highlight with regards to exposure to climate change in sub-Saharan Africa?
In this paper, we want to examine the extent to which poorer populations are more exposed to the effects of climate change than other populations. And there, in general, in the literature, there's a big agreement that poorer populations are more vulnerable to climate change than richer populations. And this is, of course, mainly due to the fact that poorer people have less absorptive capacity. So when they're hit by a shock, they cannot just absorb it. And also they have less adaptive capacity. So they don't have the means to invest in things that can make them adapt to the new climate.
Mm-hmm.
However, there's not that much evidence on exposure to the hazards that come from climate change, and whether or not they are more prevalent in areas that are poorer than areas that are richer. So that is what we wanted to do. And what we do is we take the latest climate projections from the latest ARC report, and then we overlay those with a poverty map of sub-Saharan Africa. And we want to test this hypothesis that maybe those areas that are facing larger changes in temperature and larger changes in precipitation may also be the ones where that have the higher poverty rates. And on average, this is difficult to find, but when we only look at the variation within countries, then we do find indeed that the poorer areas are also the ones that are looking into higher temperatures, and also those that are looking into more precipitation, actually. But yeah, in general, they are more exposed to climate change than other areas.
So would you say then that when you look at variation across countries, the effect of climate change on poverty is diminished because there are different conditions within each country? But then when you go at a level within countries, that's when you see the effect on people living in poverty.
Yeah, because there's a big variation in between countries in terms of poverty within Africa. So while we see the larger changes in temperatures in places like South Africa and Botswana and Namibia, these are not countries that are very poor, right? So then on average, maybe the changes are smaller in some of the poorer countries, but within the countries, on average, then the poorer districts are the ones that are hit the most by climate change.
Um,
Yeah.
so you show that there are particular regions within sub-Saharan Africa that are particularly affected. If you were to highlight, one or two regions that you're particularly concerned with regards to climate change and poverty, what would those be?
Yeah, so basically we make two sets of maps, right? We make some maps that show the average poverty rates across subnational units in Africa, and then we also make maps that show the average projected climate change in terms of temperature and rainfall. And when we look at these maps, it's obvious that those areas that look into the higher change in temperature, generally maybe the ones in the southern part of the continent, and also those places do not see an increase in rainfall. Some of these areas actually see a decrease in rainfall as well. So this would be the two things that lead to things like agricultural drought. And if we combine this then with the poverty measures, and within that overall region of southern sub-Saharan Africa, if we look into the poorer regions there, then I would definitely highlight areas such as northern Mozambique, especially a little away from the coast, so like the province of Ted in Mozambique, also Malawi and Zambia. And I would also highlight maybe the interior regions of Angola into that equation, where there's also widespread poverty. So those are some of the regions that I think should get more attention, especially when it comes to the direct impacts of climate change on agricultural productivity and agricultural droughts.
Where does that leave us in terms of policy recommendations? What and maybe differentiating that between national governments and international actors such as multilateral or bilateral donors.
Yeah, so from a policy perspective, I would say that we know that climate change is going to happen. Of course, at the COP, we're interested in limiting the effects as much as possible. But no matter what, the globe is going to be warmer, and therefore climate change adaptation is crucial, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, because climate change adaptation is a necessary condition for poverty reduction. And poverty reduction and climate change adaptation goes hand in hand a long way. But but also I would like to say that 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 some climate change adaptation initiatives may not be as pro-poor as we want them to be. Some climate change adaptation initiatives focus more on technical solutions and more on areas where they have a potential to adapt, and then that comes with the risk of leaving behind some of the areas that are just very poor and unproductive in the first place. So that's a problem I think that needs to be addressed.
If I could, building on that and going back to something you've referred to already, is in your paper you highlight the need to distinguish between hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. And so drilling down, not just looking at, okay, climate change and poverty, but actually distinguishing these three features. Could you just kind of spell that out a little bit and in a way that you
Yeah.
would kind of lead to policy implications?
Yeah, yeah. So in a sense, climate change is a natural phenomenon, right? And that could be that's comparable to a natural hazard. And indeed, climate change also entails a lot of natural hazards, such as cyclones or droughts, or so forth. But in itself, a natural hazard is not a problem, because you could have a cyclone in the middle of Antarctica that would not affect anybody at all, and we wouldn't notice that. I mean, that would not be a problem. The problem only occurs when there is exposure to that natural hazard, and anything can be exposed to natural hazards. It can be human capital, it can also be physical capital, it could be poor people, it could be rich people, and then the same natural hazard and the same exposure to a natural hazard can lead to dramatically different consequences depending on where you are, and this is where the vulnerability comes in. So a popular example is an earthquake of the same magnitude and the same number of people exposed to that earthquake have led to really hugely different consequences, whether it hits in Japan, where they have a very high resilience to this type of natural hazard, or whether it hits in a poor country like Haiti, where it has enormously big consequences. And the same goes for the hazards that come from climate change. If you have a relatively rich population, not much poverty, then you can handle the effects of climate change. Then, if you face more cyclones and more droughts, then you have the capacities to adapt. You can enhance your irrigation systems, or you can build dikes and strengthen your buildings. But in places where people do not have that capital and that resilience and absorptive capacity to do this, then the consequences are going to be much larger, and potentially this leads to a poverty trap, right?
Mm, absolutely. That's so right. And do we have, again, going a bit off piece on my questions, but do we have accurate projections based, in constructing your model, which goes to 2050? Would you say that sort of meteorologists, etc., have um, quite robust predictions for where these hazards will lead to exposure, particularly for people living in poverty?
That's a really good question, and I'm not a climate scientist as such, but of course I have tried to read the reports from the IPCC, and I have to say that when working with these climate prediction models, it becomes clear that they do not always agree. That's one thing. So basically, when we wrote this paper, the numbers were based on 9 different climate projection models that all were able to generate estimates locally about how temperatures and rainfall and so forth is projected to change over time. But um, but as I said, some of them do not agree that much. So what we did was we just took the simple average of these 9 models, and of course, if one of them disagreed a lot with the other ones, and it turns out that this one was actually the correct one, then it's then the conclusions are off. But this is the best we can do at this point, and I think that for most people, this fact that projections actually exist at the regional level, that we can tell that there's is likely going to be a difference between the climate change happening in East Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa. That's something new, and that is something that needs to be taken into consideration.
And on the topic of data, so we've talked about where the climate data currently sits. What about the poverty data that you relied on for this paper? How was it? And are there any gaps that need to be filled to be able to address this question around the relationship between climate change and poverty?
Yeah, so firstly, this data has been sourced from the World Bank, from their official statistics on poverty. So that means that it's relatively consistent across countries. But it also means that some of it is rather dated, I would say. So we're talking about poverty numbers maybe from around 2010 on average for these subnational units. And I know that they are being continuously updated, and there was just a new report coming out very recently on global poverty, where perhaps it would be interesting to look at those numbers as well. But we also know that there's a lot of stickiness in poverty numbers, that poverty rates do not just change dramatically over the course of 10 years in most African countries. And those, if we do a ranking exercise, then those districts that were the poorest in 2010 are probably also the ones that are poorest now, even though the levels might have changed.
I think it was covered in your paper, but does this include disaggregation between rural and urban areas? And does it capture the fact that, for example, people in rural areas might be migrating to urban areas when there has been a major climatic shock that has kind of destroyed the infrastructure to the extent that they've had to leave? Or vice versa, I suppose.
Not the poverty data. That's just a snapshot of districts, including both rural and urban
Yeah.
poverty. And of course, then one of the things that is evident in the data is that some of the poorer districts are usually the more rural areas, the more interior parts of the countries, whereas the coastal parts, where the bigger cities are usually located, they are on average less poor.
Mm.
And this also has an influence on the results, of course, because the climate predictions also show us that on average, the further away you move from the coast, then the changes are going to be bigger. In that sense, the ocean is sort of a buffer in terms of temperature increases. In terms of temperature, the changes will not be as dramatic if you live close to the coast. But then you have other problems, of course, that we can discuss in other studies.
Well, I thought that was such a fascinating finding from your paper. Just thinking about what we talk about when we talk about the impacts of climate change in low middle income countries. I think many people are thinking about rising sea levels, thinking about, flooding in Bangladesh or indeed in urban areas. I think that's often what makes maybe headlines. Whereas in your
Mm,
paper, and maybe those of us working in poverty research, it wasn't such a surprise, but it might be to others to find that some of the greatest impacts are actually happening further away from the coast, and the kind of
yeah.
exposure I mean, maybe this is a question, is, because you rightfully point to this distinction between exposure. Is there something to be mindful of when we think about exposure in high density urban areas near coasts and exposure to low density populations further away from the coast?
Yes, definitely. So the impacts are going to be hugely different. The people who live along the coast, they will be exposed to some more dramatic shocks, I would say, some more cyclones. For instance, people who live along the coast of Mozambique, they have seen in the recent year an increase in these really destructive cyclones. And if you're hit by one of those, then it can completely destroy your livelihood, right? But these are the relatively rare events, whereas the effects of climate change that are faced by the people who live in the rural areas, the farmers, especially the ones who grow their products or their crops in using rain-fed agriculture in relatively dry areas, they will just gradually be faced with warmer and drier climates that will make it increasingly difficult for them to produce enough yield. So that's more what you can call a slow disaster.
Right. It leaves me thinking about the kind of political economy of action on these issues, because these less frequent events, such as hurricanes in coastal areas, have a significant shock to physical and perhaps human capital and economic capital that is felt in capital cities,
Yeah,
whereas the long term effects in inland rural areas are maybe shorter, or sort of slower to reveal themselves and present less of an obvious kind of accounting challenge, where you lose buildings and you lose lives, you lose livelihood. It's a
exactly.
much slower process in rural areas.
Yeah. Yeah, so in terms of the effects on GDP, for instance, it's not going to be as dramatic as some of these coastal events, some of these cyclones that destroy a lot of physical capital, because the people who live in these areas that are faced by increasing temperatures and drier conditions, they are generally very poor and don't contribute that much to national GDP in the first place. But there's still quite many of them, right? And they are among the poorest. So if the goal is poverty reduction, then those are the areas that should be targeted with interventions.
There's quite a bit of investment now going into mitigating climate change, and as well as adapting to climate change. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how this influx of finance can be used to target both goals around climate change, but also around poverty reduction.
Yes, I think there are some examples of where this can actually work in practice and generate some positive results also in terms of poverty reduction. There is this concept, I think it was coined by the FAO, which is called climate smart agriculture. And basically, this means that they promote actions taken by the farmers that at the same time increase the productivity and and make them more resilient to climate change, but also doesn't harm the local environment. So that could be, for instance, more use of organic fertilizer. It could be ways of managing water locally, sustaining water in the fields and so forth. But it's not really compatible with increased use of pesticides or inorganic fertilizer or things that we know lead to more CO2 emissions or more degradation of the local environment. So promotion of climate smart agriculture is in general, I would say, good because it is relatively pro-poor. However, there might also be dilemmas when it comes to the targeting of these interventions because not in all places are people capable of taking up these practices. You need to have a certain level of capacity to be able to do that.
Absolutely. Glad you mentioned it. It's an area I'm working on. So I also agree that investment is sorely needed, and indeed the kind of I think one of the challenges as well is just the size of many of these kind of financial instruments are such that they struggle to reach farmers. They might only
Yeah.
reach kind of larger institutions.
I've been working on this research project in Ethiopia about climate change adaptation for the past 5 years, and I think Ethiopia is an example where the amount of money that goes into the system is actually large enough for it to have a real impact on a lot of people's lives. But they also have all the all the infrastructure in place. The Ministry of Agriculture is very, you know, spread out into the whole country,
Mm.
and they have extension agents everywhere. And when we do a random sample of poor rural households, the majority of those, they have had visits by extension agents from the Ministry of Agriculture who have promoted practices that you could say are climate smart. So this is not the case in most countries in Africa, but it is possible with the right amount of funding
Absolutely.
and
And
infrastructure.
political will, as you said, to kind
Yeah, yeah,
of maintain extension programs. When you have a limited
exactly.
budget, you know, those coastal urban areas are getting a lot of investment and visible investment, but that rural infrastructure is so important.
Yes.
Um, so maybe a last one is that so in your paper you note, I think early on, that although there's a lot of talk about the relationship between climate change and poverty, there's still a lot of unknowns. It's a kind of well-trodden topic to say, you know, those living in poverty are most impacted by climate change, but we don't fully kind of comprehend what that means. Can you unpack that a little bit more, and just tell us a bit what you think would be the kind of leading things that we don't know that we should be seeking answers to?
Mm. Yeah, so so as we mentioned in the paper, there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to the effects of climate change. There is quite a lot of studies on the effects of agricultural drought, lack of rainfall on the livelihoods of farmers, but there's relatively little known. This alludes also to what we talked about before about these climate adaptation interventions. There's relatively little known about their effect on poverty. There's much known about their effect on agriculture, on what is produced, and on agricultural productivity and so forth, but relatively little on the impacts on poverty, because the poverty reduction programs usually do not combine with these climate adaptation projects. They are sort of in separate silos, which is also the case in Ethiopia, where we have the PSNP. It has a component that is related to the PSNP is the social protection program here, but it has a component that relates to climate change, but it's not core in the program. And on the other hand, we have projects like the agricultural growth program, which promotes agricultural productivity, but poverty reduction is not at the core of that. So we risk that if a lot of money is challenged into channeled into um, climate adaptation projects, that poverty is ignored a little bit, and that there might be some pockets around the country where a lot of poor people live, but they are not included in the climate projects, so they are more or less left behind. Especially if the budget for poverty reduction is is the same as the budget for climate adaptation, which is, I guess, it is for many donors at least.
Mm.
There's also another unknown, which is the effect of increased rainfall in many poor areas. We've seen, according to these projections, there's going to be an increase in rainfall in some areas, for instance, in the Sahel, and also in Somalia and the eastern part of Ethiopia. And we've already seen that there might be some consequences of these, for instance, floodings in some of these areas, but also locust infestations. And these are the shocks that appear when things change rather rapidly. But we don't know basically in the long run how this is going to affect these areas. Of course, it will be possible to have more cattle if there's more grass, but it might also lead to conflict. It might lead to people switching their livelihoods to agriculture instead of yeah, having livestock. So we don't know basically what will happen in these places where rainfall is expected to increase.
We did a kind of review of the evidence on the relationship between climate change and poverty. And just to kind of, add to your findings, is it was remarkable how little kind of fully integrated analysis there is looking at both climate change and poverty. As you said, there's a lot of research on climate change, there's a lot of research on poverty, and then there's a lot of assumptions that are made between the
Yeah.
two, that people living in poverty are most impacted. And that is true, but the nuance of that is what we
Mm.
need in order to inform policy, in order to make budget allocations,
Yeah.
and and not make misconceptions. Like you said, it's not just drought, it's also flooding, and it's not just coastal areas, it's inland rural areas. There's
Exactly.
incredible amount of misconceptions. And ultimately, I think those who are impacted know it so well. They live it and have been living it for quite some time. When you speak to an older farmer in particular, they can tell you in detail, season on season, how things have gone. And so much advice is does not seek their input and does not recognize them
Mm.
as experts as well. So a lot of
Yeah.
unknowns and a lot of gaps that we could be filling by speaking to the people impacted.
While I think there's, as I started off saying, there's a general recognition that the poorer populations are a lot more vulnerable. What we show here is that in some cases, or in many cases, they are also more exposed to the changes, right? So there's a big difference between living at the coast, where perhaps the temperature increase is going to be 1 degree, and then living inland, where the temperature increase may be 3 degrees. That can have a huge 3 degrees can have a huge impact on whether or not you are actually able to grow crops in that area in the future. So so this comes on top of the fact that the poorer populations are already the most vulnerable. If they are also the more exposed populations, then more attention needs to be drawn to those places.
Mm, absolutely. And it's also a reminder that even those not working in this area will need to
Mm.
start thinking about it. I was once had the opportunity to speak to, I think it was the Ministry of Urban Development in Ethiopia, actually. And he had told me, and this reaffirms your finding, is he told me that a good urbanization strategy was a good rural strategy. Because
Yeah.
people are ultimately, if you don't create opportunities and if you don't reduce vulnerabilities and exposures in rural areas, people might, whether being attracted to urban areas or being pushed to urban areas out of, as you said, a temperature increase that makes it completely infeasible to grow food or to live, are going to have to move. And you now
Mm.
have the migration of the challenge to other parts of the country. So
Yeah.
it's sort of everyone's challenge, even if it's not, you're not working in rural development or agriculture.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. And there's also the issue of commercialization. So if you have to switch to a different type of crop because of climate change, then you need to be able to sell that on a market. And there's a big difference between living close to an urban area or living far away from an urban area in terms of being able to sell your products. So that's another thing.
Absolutely.
They have a lot of ideas about which crops are the best to produce in a place like Ethiopia, and they experiment a lot. But ultimately, you need to be able to sell it, and and that's related a lot to the urban economies as well.
Yes, and indeed, some crops that with climate change could disappear, crops like cocoa, in West
Mm,
Africa, that are so, uh, I guess, vulnerable to climate
yeah,
change,
yeah.
that it's become unviable. And if you're a farmer with, you know, who can't take on significant risks,
Mm.
And the risk of although cocoa might be high priced because there's now limited supply in the market, if you're not guaranteed that you're going to have a yield at the end of the year, something from
Mm.
maize is better than nothing from cocoa. And so you could
Yeah.
ultimately have crops that many people appreciate, such as cocoa, being almost inviable in certain
Yeah.
countries. Mm.